few notes here. So first, it was a controversial story. It was about lust and romance and forbidden love, um, and sex and death. And so it actually went to trial for obscenity at the time. And then it ultimately, we talked about literary realism versus romanticism, but it was also a class criticism about the difficulties of middle class or poorer. Also, the idea that one shouldn't aspire for dreams beyond their means, that they should stick to their class, to their culture, to their significant other, that they shouldn't aspire to go beyond, that ultimately that will lead to tragedy. And that it's a criticism of rigid social class, but it's also a focus on reality about how a lot of those aspirations do set up expectations that often hurt us in the long run. Okay, so as we look at the second half of the text, and we're going to skip around more than we did in the first half, I want you to think about this question, because this question is going to come back to us around midway through the semester, and perhaps at the end of the semester as well. What insights into human nature does this text make us think about? In other words, if you did not know what humans were and you came across this text, what are some basic assumptions that you would make? And this question is for the Kugelmass episode, but I think it can be asked about any text we read. So if this was the only thing you knew of humans, what conclusions could you make about our character, about the way we act, about our hopes, dreams, etc.? So I want you to think about that as we move on to analyze the rest of the text. So let's see right here. Okay. So he meets Emma, and let's see, let's pick it up right about here. Emma Bovary smiled flirtatiously and said, "Would you like a drink? A glass of wine, perhaps?" She's beautiful, Kugelmass thought. What a contrast with that troglodyte, which is a hermit or a caveman, or just a term for ignorant person, who shared his bed. He felt a sudden impulse to take this vision into his arms and tell her she was the kind of woman he had dreamed of all his life, right? So that sounds like out of a romance novel. He's going to be this heroic figure out of a romance novel. "Yes, some wine," he said hoarsely. "White, no. Red, no. White, make it white." Okay, so after he has this impulse, like a romance novel, that he's going to be like a guy on a cover of a romance novel, he all of a sudden, in a hoarse, weak voice, is indecisive, right? So it's again this ironic coupling of images there. Let's see, let's skip down a little bit. And right about here. What he didn't realize was that at this very moment, students in various classrooms across the country were saying to their teachers, "Who is this character on page 100? A bald Jew is kissing Madame Bovary." A teacher in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, sighed and thought, "Jesus, these kids, with their pot and acid, what goes through their minds?" Okay, so this is a great example of what's called metafiction, and it's commentary about fiction in fiction. Okay, so it's a moment where it pulls you out of the action and says, let's look at what the author's doing here. So in this case, he's saying, can you believe this? I've come up with this concept. It's like I'm on pot and acid. It's crazy, right? This whole concept is crazy or a farce, right? So it's a commentary on fiction from within fiction. We get another ironic element here. "My God, I'm doing it with Madame Bovary," Kugelmass whispered to himself. "Me, who failed freshman English." So he's a prominent professor of humanities at a university, and he failed freshman English, the opposite of what one might suspect. Let's see. Another idea of intertextuality acting as kind of a Easter egg is this random name in here, Abe Borenson's church. It's a character from Madame Bovary who focused on worldly matters, so the world and things and people over spiritual, and really didn't pay as much attention to faith. But he was also a simple person, not a flat character, a simple, a troglodyte, an oaf, right? And so by understanding that context, you can get at what Woody Allen's trying to get at here. It gives you some more insight into that. Same thing with people like Strasberg, who's, if you look up, he's the father of method acting, meaning being in character even when you're not on film. So like Heath Ledger, when he was the Joker, did this, where he lived like the Joker in order to try to get into that character. We have another example of metafiction. I cannot get my mind around this, a Stanford professor said. First, a strange character named Kugelmass, and now she's gone from the book. Well, I guess the mark of a classic is that you can reread it 1,000 times and always find something new. Okay, so again, it's commentary on fiction. So it's saying, you know, every time you reread something, you can get more out of it and more out of it and more out of it. In this case, something literally changes. But anyone who studies literature figures this out, that you could read a book dozens of times. And if you know how to analyze literature, each time you could read it differently with a different focus, looking for different theories, looking for different perspectives, and understanding the text more fully. For instance, I mentioned this in another video, that one of James Joyce's book, Ulysses, is one of the most studied texts ever. And in my graduate studies, I spent over a year studying this book. I spent every day probably 15 hours or so, well, at least 12 hours a day for over a year studying this book. And not only do you read the book, but then you read, there's books upon books of footnotes about the book. Then there's books upon books on the book, biographies on the author. There's literary theories applied to the book. There's metaphors within the book, and many, many, many different levels. And so that's a commentary on fiction again. So let's point out another irony is just throughout the whole thing. So it's Persky, we have to get her back. She's trying to get Emma back he's trying to get Emma back because he's afraid of what she's doing. He says, I'm a married man and I have class in 3 hours. So this man who didn't care about his marriage, didn't care about his career throughout the whole story, all of a sudden he cares, right? So then we get, bear with me, Sugar, Kugelmass said. He was pale and sweaty. He kissed her again, raced to the elevators, yelled at Persky over a payphone in the plaza lobby, and just made it home before midnight. Anytime you hear, midnight in a story and there being something that changes, you definitely want to think of the story book, with Cinderella and all that. Then we get Emma. She's in the hotel, and she says, get me back in the novel or marry me, Emma told Kugelmass. Meanwhile, I want to get a job or go to class, because watching TV all day is the pits. Again, this is the opposite of what we would expect, because you would think a person, if we brought someone back in time from 180 years ago, or 150 at that point, and brought them to modern times and showed them a TV, you'd think they'd be fascinated with that for a long time, right? This magical talking box. And so the fact that she's complaining about it tells us something about her character as well. Let's see. I'm like a wild animal, Kugelmass went on. I'm sneaking around town, and Emma and I have headed up to here with one another. Not to mention a hotel tab that reads like the defense budget. So this is some of that class indication that we're looking for, right? So this idea that he can't afford her. He can't afford to live that life forever. He doesn't have the finances for it. Nuance my foot. I'm pouring Dom Perignon and black eggs into this little mouse, plus her wardrobe, plus she's enrolled at the neighborhood playhouse and suddenly needs professional photos. Also, Persky, Professor Fivish Kopkind, who teaches Comp Lit and who has always been jealous of me, has identified me as sporadically appearing character in the Flaubert book. He's threatened to go to Daphne. I see ruin and alimony in jail for adultery with Madame Bovary. My wife will reduce me to beggary. Okay, so that parallels very well with Madame Bovary. And then we get this framing of the story. We had the analyst earlier saying, I'm an analyst, not a magician. And here we get the great Persky saying, I'm a magician, not an analyst, right? Saying so perhaps it's saying that neither a magician nor an analyst can help Kugelmass with his problems because he's just so far gone. So let's look at these last couple paragraphs and then we'll wrap it up. Again, the lovers hurried to the magician's apartment, and again Emma Bovary climbed into the cabinet with her boxes. This time there was no kiss. Persky shut the doors, took a deep breath, and tapped the box 3 times. There was the reassuring popping noise, and when Persky peered inside, the box was empty. Madame Bovary was back in her novel. Kugelmass heaved a great sigh of relief and pumped the magician's hand. It's over, he said. I learned my lesson. I'll never cheat again, I swear it. He pumped Percy's hand again and made a mental note to send him a necktie. So this is where I want to return to this idea of flat and round characters. Okay, when I ask students who's a flat character and who's a round character in this story, I think most people agree that everybody except Emma and Kugelmass are flat. Okay, and then there's some debate over Emma and Kugelmass. If you go to just one side of the story, are they complicated? Are they complex or not complex? Both of them, in some ways, probably lean a little more towards complex, right? But in other ways, they're also just kind of stereotypical of what you would expect out of them, right? In some ways. So you're saying leans towards complex, but not so sure. So then, do they experience development? Do they change over the course of the story? Is there epiphany? Well, with Emma, there's some arguments for small epiphanies. I'm not sure I see it, but I think there could be an argument made. With Kugelmass here, he's saying, I learned my lesson. So he's clearly saying, I am a round character. I'll never cheat again, I swear it. The problem, 3 weeks later, at the end of a beautiful spring afternoon, Persky answered his doorbell. It was Kugelmass with a sheepish expression on his face. Okay, Kugelmass, the magician said. Where to this time? It's just this once, Kugelmass said. So really, he didn't change. He just said one time that he was going to, right? So whether he's a flat or a round character is up for debate. But I want you to continue to think about why a writer would use flat characters. Because obviously the round characters in many ways are more interesting. So why use flat characters? So a few of the reasons. Sometimes you just need a foil. You just need somebody who to bounce your main characters off of, the round characters off of. Sometimes you want those characters to universalize the experience, so It's kind of like a horoscope, how almost anybody can read themselves into any given horoscope, or most horoscopes. It's the same here, that, oh, this person's this type of person. Yeah, part of me is like that, so it's easier to universalize them in some ways. Or it could be the opposite, that the author doesn't want you to identify, right? If more information is given on Daphne, you might feel sorry for her. You might feel bad. So just saying she's an oaf doesn't give you the full complex picture that would evoke more sympathy for her. So we get another example of intertextuality here. Listen, you've read Portnoy's Complaint. Remember the monkey? If you were to go look that up, and you'd find out it's a middle-aged Jewish man complaining about sex and not getting sex, and he ends up with a woman very problematically and controversially that he terms the monkey. So he goes into the box and he says that he just wants sex and romance, and he goes, "What we go through for a pretty face." So Persky tossed in a copy of Portnoy's Complaint and rapped 3 times on the box. This time, instead of a popping noise, there was a dull explosion, followed by a series of crackling noises and a shower of sparks. Persky leaped back, was seized by a heart attack, and dropped dead. The cabinet burst into flames, and eventually the entire house burnt down. Kugelmass, unaware of this catastrophe, had his own problems. He had not been thrust into Portnoy's Complaint, or into any other novel for that matter. He'd been projected into an old textbook, remedial Spanish, and was running for his life over a barren, rocky terrain as the word tenor, to have a large and hairy irregular verb raced after him on spindly legs. Okay, so all that foreshadowing that we got leading up to this seems to come to play here, that the box was shabby. He was in a broken down apartment, that the great Persky didn't look so great. All of it does end in catastrophe, right? Who would want, what a horrible end to end up in a grammar book, right? I'm a person who can't stand grammar. That's for another day, but I can't imagine. That's a fate worse than death. Okay, so to tie it up, continue to think about what insights into human nature this text has, why we use flat characters, and what assumptions could you make about human nature with this text. Okay, so I think I'm going to end this video here, and what I'll do is I'll create a separate video to introduce Plato, because we're going a little long here. And Plato is a difficult text, so make sure to follow my instructions carefully. Thanks.